we're good.
I was so tempted to be like, do we need to be quiet right now?
Shall we then?
I think we shall.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night. Whenever you happen to be watching this, welcome to another episode of the Round Table with the Society of Shady Characters. Today, would you like to introduce our topic?
Yeah, so today we're talking about the topic of is God dead or not in American culture, or is God dead?
Yeah, this is founded off of the famous line from Nietzsche saying God is dead and his implications of that, and we've killed him. So we're going to be discussing the philosophical, social, and theological background to that statement and whether we think it is in any form valid, especially in society today, given that he said that over almost 150 years ago now.
1882, 140 years ago, 141.
So, Ryan, would you like to lead us off?
Yeah, so Nietzsche was a German philosopher who actually was an atheist. The quote is like, God remains dead and we have killed him. Nietzsche's argument is that after the Enlightenment, with increases in the studies of science, mathematics, and philosophy, the belief in God was becoming unbelievable within European society, because for so long the church's influence, like the church and the state, were so heavily connected and intertwined, and with the Enlightenment, they were starting to become separated. Mm-hmm. So when you look at that separation, it's due to the increases in the studies of science, mathematics, and philosophy, where you're gaining this new understanding of human life in so many different forms, and so many different people are becoming skeptical of the church's behavior. And I mean, at the same time, you're seeing the church splinter into all these different denominations across the world, or the Christian church. And then on top of that, there was a rise of atheism during the period that Nietzsche was writing. So because of that, like, you have the state separating church and state, and when we say states, we mean European countries. So separation of like the church and state over in Europe, and then on top of that, atheism is growing in popularity. But not only that, it's becoming more culturally acceptable. So when you look at those two things, like that separation that's occurring, and then the fact that people are now able to express their atheism openly, is contributing to what Nietzsche is arguing, that the belief in God was becoming unbelievable, and that's why he wrote, God remains dead, and we have killed him.
Yeah, I was trying to read up on it, and it seemed like I got the same sentiment, basically, that following the French Enlightenment in the late 18th century and early 19th century, people were starting to finally be able to detach science and government from theology. So, states no longer needed this. Before, in the centuries following the spread of Christianity, and actually really predating Christianity, now that I think about it, this idea that I have the right from God to rule over you, is something we heard from monarchs, from tyrants, authoritarians, and now following the Enlightenment, we get a huge shift, especially with the establishment of republics and democracies, especially one significant one being the United States. Now the right to govern is no longer given from divine authority, but the right to govern comes from the rule of the people. So that was something that also carried over into science as well. Like, science was no longer, it was becoming detached, where it was no longer we are studying God's creation. It's more like we are observing the universe, and that we're making our own connections based off of that. And I think that goes hand in hand with what you were saying, of people were now being more free to take these thoughts, publicize them, and share them, and it was becoming more widespread along with the rise in atheism. Do you have anything from this?
I mean, like you said, the idea of like God-given power predates Christianity. If you look at ancient Greek, ancient Roman times, they're like, the gods have given me power to rule over this area. And conquer this land. So like with that idea disappearing, Nietzsche makes the assumption like, okay, there's no reason for states to have a god and for people to continue to believe in a god if because he claims like the main reason for God at the time was so people could control one another.
Yeah. So just to make sure that we can, playing with the audio, can all establish the same baseline. Let me just read the quote from Nietzsche. He wasn't the first person to use the term God is dead, but it was his work that popularized the phrase. Mm-hmm. So just to establish the baseline, I'll just read the quote. This is from Nietzsche's The Gay Science. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all, that the world had yet owned, has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to cleanse ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves become gods simply to appear worthy of it? So, yeah, jumping off that quote. So, I guess do we think, based on, obviously this was written back in 1882, looking back on history from now till then, do you think that we have properly established answers to these questions?
Definitely not. I would say no.
I agree with Ryan here. I don't think we have answers to these questions. I think there's some people that would say some things may answer them, but it's not a full consensus, and people would disagree with some of the things.
Well, I think it's telling because we established that Nietzsche was a atheist. Now, obviously, given the time period, he didn't grow up atheistic, mm-hmm. but he grew up in a Christian society with a Christian family, but due to his skepticism and his analysis, became atheistic. But I think it's pretty telling that even in this quote, he doesn't say it insofar as much of a happy thing. This death of God, obviously he still views it as progress, but
I think in The Gay Science he kind of describes, like, in the same vein as that, he talks about like the possibilities that it would bring for philosophers and free spirits, but only later points that, like, I think he shifts as he as The Gay Science is published, right, and later in his philosophical career and writings, then he shifts towards that nihilism point that you're getting to,
right,
where he becomes more weary of it, but he proposes the solution that the way to deal with this, and as Brett and I had concurred, we believe that we haven't reached this, but Nietzsche says that the way to handle with this is basically to have individuals with such strong will that they can create their own, like, purpose and meaning for life. Because right. if Nietzsche is right, if God is dead and we have killed him, where we have this belief or unbelief, or the belief that God is becoming unbelievable, mm-hmm. then life is eventually going to become meaningless, because all of life's meaning, especially then and still now, is rooted in God being at the center of creation and at the center of the universe. Because if you know that at the end of the day that your life is everything you do in life is going to come down to a final point where you'll be judged and condemned, or gain
saved,
or be saved, then, like, that gives life meaning. Where if you kill that and you take that away and people stop believing in that, then eventually, if they don't replace that with something, if they don't create their own will where they become strong enough to replace what God is and what God, like, was, as Nietzsche puts it, then you're going to have people who will start to believe that life is meaningless.
Right. I think you pulled on a really good thread there, and I was planning on getting towards that eventually. I think we should touch on perhaps that nihilism that he started mm-hmm. to worry about then. Because here's another quote from Nietzsche following the widespread publication. He says, "When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. And of course, it's this Christian morality which governs all the states, at least in the Western world at this point.
Yes.
That's what all the laws are based off of. That's what social custom is based off of, for the most part. And so he says that when you destroy one piece of Christian doctrine or the Christian faith, then you destroy all of it.
Yeah.
And you inevitably then destroy the fabric of the social
of morality,
nature. And what you end up with is society collapsing into nihilism if it doesn't properly
adjust,
replace it. If it pulls out this key value setting belief but does not replace it, it will only fall to nihilism. And so perhaps we can touch a little bit first on the threat of nihilism and why Nietzsche, despite what he claims to be progress in the death of God, is concerned with the rise of nihilism following this, and why he eventually proposes his own solution. So first, maybe we touch on nihilism.
So, I mean, just like Ryan said earlier, the nihilism from Nietzsche didn't necessarily come until later when the mass publication happened. At first, he's like happy because he claims progress is being made towards a better society. But like, as soon as you realize that there's no point to life, there's no reason to live besides just being happy in the moment, then you're going to get nihilistic and be like, okay, there's no point for me to do this because I'll only get this little bit of happiness. At the end of the day, it's not going to matter. While the person that believes in God is doing things every day for that end point where the culminating end of their life where they'll either be condemned or saved. So, I mean, as soon as he recognizes that there's no point in life without a purpose, he realizes, I think he almost realizes his mistake in publishing his book. And that's why he sets off to find it.
Or at least it's incompletion.
Incompletion
of
thought, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I felt like I noticed from his writing and his life leading up to this is that as we mentioned, he grew up in this society of Christian values. One thing that I seem to pick up on is his frustration with the Christian morality of there is a God, and it's the highest God, and in order to obtain the good of this God, we must give up all the senses of the world, basically. Is this frustration that he thinks it's not a proper answer from the Christian morality side. He thinks that the Christian morality is wrong because he believes it shuns the world and in a way that he thinks is not good for the continuation of the species on Earth, basically. Because I think he is a little bit frustrated and afraid that the shunning of the world will cause people to not care for it, or at least they'll diminish the human experience as he sees it, by shutting down their senses and not appeasing them.
Not appeasing their
when he doesn't think that the point of life and the reason why we have those senses is to get rid of them. I know you were going to say something before I took that.
Well, in like one of the last like published works, Will to Power from Nietzsche, he's quoted saying, "I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently. The advent of nihilism for some time now over our whole European culture has been moving towards catastrophe." So, like,
so we get that direct,
as you and Brett were
nihilism and catastrophe go hand in hand, is what he's saying. So,
and I would say, like, if you look at the course of the 20th century,
his writing was definitely very on par with, you will get this if you do not properly take care of it. If you do not create these rituals of atonement, if you don't create these events to realize what we've really done, you will suffer. And his point, to your point, his point wasn't that we got rid of him and therefore at this point no longer, that this section of our lives is a moot point. He points out that we must replace it or else it will be filled with something else. And we get that at the very start of the 20th century with all these huge rises in ideologies, mostly governmental. So fascism, communism, are two of the most prevailing ones of the 20th century.
That had the most dangerous implications on human history.
Right, and I think now in the 21st century, we're seeing the impact of shifting religiosity and the sacred into the political realm in the United States with democracy.
Well, I would even say just the focus on the individual
versus focus on the group or the culture of the family.
Right. Yeah. I'm just saying it's not solely, fascism and communism.
Yes,
it's even maybe in the 20th century, especially in the early 20th century. But now we're definitely seeing how that lack of separation of church and state, now it's become that the state is the church of the people, and people's whole lives are wrapped up in this matter, this movement, and it's all being encompassed within a governmental practice.
People identify and put their whole selves in conservative party, liberal party,
right? And it's sacred to them,
and that's becoming their identity.
That's cult-like following,
exactly, and that's not healthy.
And Nietzsche knew that.
And Nietzsche called that out in 1882, 140 years ago.
Right. So he knew that, and he predicted that people would fall prey to it. So then, maybe let's move forward to what. Once he realized this catastrophe of nihilism would be the outpouring, that people would collapse their belief systems and not properly replace it. That nihilism wasn't the answer, that the question of everything, and that there's no value or meaning in anything. He realized that there was value in things, and there was value in life, and there was meaning to life. But now we can get, I think, to that point, that thread you were pulling on earlier.
Where you have to cultivate the will.
Right, so now what is the better alternative to nihilism that Nietzsche was starting to develop?
So Nietzsche kind of argues, I don't really have a lot of notes on this, but the core argument is that Nietzsche argues for the ability to develop one's own will to live.
Right.
That no matter how you feel when you wake up in the morning, whether you're happy, sad, depressed, you must become this person who has the innate desire to keep going no matter what, and that through the struggle of life, through striving for something greater than yourself, to strive for improvement each and every day, that is the replacement that he proposes. And that's a really really oversimplification of the solution that Nietzsche proposes, where he's people must cultivate their own will to live, and that they must root their lives in the ability to be able to find that.
Right. The note that I kind of took on it was Nietzsche's answer was vaguely around the idea that each person ought to genuinely sit and establish their own values and their own will to live. Kind of values and will to live kind of go in hand, and that this is because values are important to the conduct of a good human being and citizen in society. So you can't have a society of people who have no values, because all you will get is chaos.
Anarchy.
Right. And we can see very clearly through basic thought experiments that in order to have something worth participating in, there must be rules for it. That's why sports have rules. If you, for instance, if you just played a sport, there's one thought experiment that I really like. It's Brett, let's play a game together. You want to play?
Not now.
No, do you want to play a game?
Sure, let's play a game.
Okay. Your turn. Go ahead.
I win.
I defeat you.
I win still.
I kill your mom.
I win. My mom doesn't.
But you can't. It's a pointless game. You can't do anything.
Yeah.
There's. What do you mean? It's your turn. I can do anything I want, but that's not how society works. You can't just do whatever.
No.
And at the end of the day, Brett he says he wins, and then I kill him and I kill his family, and he still thinks he wins. And is that how you want to conduct a society where you kill people and if you want to, or you take things if you want to?
See, I don't think a society can even form if there is no values, because if someone walks around thinking that, okay, I can kill whoever I want and not get punished for it, whether that punishment's intrinsic or extrinsic,
Right. And then I can kill you out
and
of
you can
revenge for the
kill-
other person.
and everyone thinks the same thing, then suddenly no one's going to start interacting, because if I interact with you, there's a non-zero chance I'm going to die from that interaction. And so suddenly everyone becomes isolated, and with that isolation comes lack of trade, lack of commerce, lack of relationships, and society would fail to exist.
Right.
Well, that's where you get into like Hobbesian, like social contract theory, where
basic economics,
brutish, nasty, and short. Like if you develop a society where nothing matters and you can do things if you want to or not, humans will resort to conflict, is what Hobbes proposes, and that you need to come under order, like create a sovereign to order.
You need to establish order in order for people to operate within a system.
Yes. And Hobbes predates Nietzsche.
Right, because that's the English Enlightenment.
Exactly.
Before the establishment of the states, like the revolution.
So you have Hobbes, who I would say writes more in a Christian dominated society.
Right.
So I would say that Hobbes would argue for that religion and the state to be intertwined, like the church and the state to be intertwined.
Yeah.
Whereas Nietzsche is proposing, well, no, you don't do that, but you still have to be able to operate without succumbing to ideology,
Right.
but also have this order.
Right. And so I like that we established this difference between the different Enlightenment periods. So Nietzsche operating post French Enlightenment. So that's where we start to get these concepts of modernism and then postmodernism. I know that you took some notes on postmodernism, so if you want to, I know that postmodernism is a term that gets thrown around really easily these days with people I don't think who've actually done any form of study on it. So maybe you can at least lay down a groundwork for us to work off of.
So what I kind of was looking at, and just through like certain classes that I've taken and touching on postmodernism, kind of rejects objectivity and universal truth in favor for subjectivity, and emphasizes the importance of multiple perspectives. Like, because, I mean, you have that quote, like, history is written by the victors, but then there's also the perspective of the losers,
Right.
like in everything. So, like, postmodernism, and this is a really simple, like, analogy, like, what was true to the Nazis under postmodernism is, like, their
truth.
Whereas, like, what was true to the Allied forces is, like, their
truth.
version of truth.
And the only reason we believe the Allies were right was because they won and spread the word.
Exactly.
That would be the postmodernist example of what's right and wrong.
Yes.
Kind of lines up with the concept of relativism. That, oh, well, they believe in that, and there is no universal truth. So maybe they're right to be with acting the way they are based on what they think. But I think this, and I wouldn't do that, but that's not what they think. So it's okay for them, but it wouldn't be okay for me. You have any thoughts on that, Brett?
I mean, I think you guys pretty much nailed it. It's like, you can't look at postmodernism and bringing up the World War II example with the Nazis. It's hard to look at that and be like, yeah, postmodernism is correct. It's definitely the correct view on the world. It's like, how can you justify killing millions of people? You really can't.
Well, you can.
If it's postmodernism.
And
no. Exactly.
Well, I think most people can acknowledge that there are things that we hold as human beings that we can acknowledge as true without a mathematical proof for it. Like, you can't, as smart as you are, you're not going to write a mathematical proof for why the Nazis were wrong.
Yeah, it's
to kill just millions of people.
Human intuition. It's like, okay, is killing 6 million Jews for no reason a bad thing? Yes or no? Yes, that's a bad thing, and there's no reason or way to write a mathematical proof like you were saying.
Right, so I think that human intuition part is where we start to diverge with the post-Enlightenment and post-modern movement. Is I think that following this new development of science being the arbiter of reality. So now the way we decide if something is true or how something is through science, through the scientific method and through theory. I think that in doing that, we have forgotten the ability to know truths and to know like things about the universe without having the scientific method verify it.
Yeah.
Do you have
I
anybody
completely agree with that. Like, we've given up human intuition in favor of trying to find out facts scientifically, and it's not possible 100% of the time. And you come by making the assumption that it is possible 100% of the time to follow the scientific method and get an answer that you're looking for, you fall into a logical fallacy where suddenly you're missing half the equation and you come to the conclusion that 1 equals 2.
Right. And I think that you know, if you just look across things like art and literature, you can look at a piece of art and sure, maybe one person will think one is better than another or more beautiful, but you know, humans have an ability to distinguish and discern.
Beauty is objective. It's not all.
Like, I don't subscribe to the full belief that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I don't think the beholder is the establishment of what is beautiful. I think it's the thing itself.
And I think like there's always exceptions to the rule, right? Like, but 9 times out of 10, I mean, you look at Michelangelo's like statue of David, and like people will go like around the like come from around the world.
They'll go thousands of miles, spend thousands of dollars just to see this and take a picture with it.
Exactly, or like the Mona Lisa. Like people agree, like that is beautiful art.
Right, and I understand that, you know, with the art world, it almost becomes an economics of demand where something is more popular because it is desired. And, you know, that's maybe not the best way to determine all worth. But there's clearly a capability to determine a better piece of art from a worse piece of art with mostly overlap.
Yes.
Like there will obviously be beliefs in both directions.
Yes.
But there is a general ability to center that.
9 times out of 10, like Ryan was saying.
Yeah. Like,
right.
Like there's going to be exceptions to the rule. Like I may prefer like a certain painting over what Brett prefers.
Yeah.
Or I may not find it as appealing as Brett finds it. But like that doesn't mean that like I'm 100% correct, or that Brett's 100% wrong, or that Brett is 100% right and I'm 100% wrong.
But it means that there is a beauty in it.
Exactly.
And that's something that you can't determine the beauty of something based on a quantifiable value. I mean, you can poll, like you can poll people, get everybody's take on it, democratically take the vote of how beautiful something is. But that's not science.
No.
But somehow we've ended up at this point, especially in the 21st century, where the only truth is science. And I mean, we came to college in the middle of COVID-19. That's all we ever heard was it's science. The science. It's fact. The experts say this. It's like this has become something beyond a study of fact. It's become a religion.
Almost. Yeah.
The science has become a new religion. And it's clear that because what we knew at the start of COVID is not what we knew at the end, but somehow we were supposed to treat it as a universal truth at the beginning when we knew we didn't have all the information.
Well, that's what like truth is. Like you don't always have 100% of the information all of the time, right? Like,
right. And the funny part is, along that whole time when we didn't know what the truth about COVID was, or what the proper response was, or how far apart you would have had to be to not contract it from somebody else, or how long you'd need to quarantine to get. Even though we didn't know, there was a truth. There was.
Yeah.
Like at the beginning, we thought it had X mortality rate, and at the end, we found out that it didn't have the same mortality rate that we thought it had at the beginning. But that doesn't mean that the mortality rate changed. It always had that lethality, the same lethality. We just didn't perceive
what
it.
It was.
We didn't know what it was, but we were supposed to treat it as a universal truth in the meantime.
It's like when COVID first started, it was like 2 weeks is the quarantine time. If you get exposed, it's 2 weeks. If you have COVID, it's 2 weeks. And then 2 years down the line, it's like, okay, if you get COVID, quarantine yourself for 5 days, and that's it. Like, things change. There's a proper answer the entire time, but you don't know it until the end.
And that's not to discredit science, and not to say that science cannot find truth. Like, obviously, at the end of the day, we know more at the end of the pandemic than we did at the beginning. We know more objectively.
Oh, for sure.
But we have these ways of establishing truths that don't, like, the scientific method is clearly not a perfect method.
And nowadays, people are claiming it is a perfect method, and they're putting their whole identity into the scientific method, into a party of their choice, whether it be left or right.
Right.
And
into a narrative of their choice.
They're making that their identity versus religion. And back to Nietzsche,
you got it. I believe in you.
Back to like what he said about you have to find that alternative, or else you're going to fall into this nihilistic view. People are using the alternative of science and things like that, and replacing God with that. And I think it's making society worse overall.
Right. So let's turn this back on its head to Nietzsche. The establishment of each person's own will to live or their own value system.
Mm-hmm.
How do we determine which one is better than another? Because I don't think that to say that each person has their own therefore you must act in accordance of what each person individually believes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's a sufficient answer, because you can't conduct a society that way.
Like this theory of relativism.
Right.
That's what it's a hard word to say.
You can't pronounce Nietzsche. You can't pronounce relativism. We'll get through it eventually. But you can't conduct a society where I think it's okay to steal, and you're a business owner and you think it's wrong and that it's your property and it's your right to be able to distribute it and sell it as you please. What's going to be the arbiter of that? The government? That's a dangerous game to play. Because originally, before Nietzsche, before the Enlightenment, it was God. The arbiter of whether that was right or wrong was God.
Yeah.
And you can argue whether you believe that God is right or wrong, but at least we had one standard. And that standard wasn't in the hands of... Now you can say that, it was in the hands of people's it was in the hands of the church, whatever. But at least it was one standard. And it wasn't malleable.
Yeah.
Very malleable. So now, I don't think that it's a sufficient answer to conduct a society where people have their own beliefs and they hold their beliefs to be true, but those values can directly contradict other people's who they also think can hold their values and have those be true. It's impossible to have a society that's that word communion, like the communion being like the joining together, union, together, communion,
yes,
coexistence. Like you can't do that on different.
If it's relative to each person,
right? Because then you aren't living in unity together, and you will have conflict. And then the old English Enlightenment take on that was that it would resolve to conflict.
Yeah,
and that's not how you can't run a society purely on conflict. It's called a crime rate.
At least,
and people don't want to live where there's a high crime rate because their personal stuff gets destroyed or taken, and no one wants that.
Yeah.
So how do we establish a means of discerning which values are better than others? Because if we don't think there's each individual one, then we have to believe that there's things that get closer and closer to what's best.
See, I don't think we can discern what's better without having a center figure like God. I think you have to have some root where everyone can agree that that's a starting place to even start discerning those values, and because of that, it's pointless to even try unless
this objective moral standard.
Exactly.
Right. So it comes back to this whole: you need to be able to. We humans are able to intuit things without the use of a scientific method, and so I think that's where the total union of the ability to learn truth and acknowledge what's better or worse comes to a front. So like the use of literature, like we have stories that we know are inherently better stories, not just in quality, but also say like a character. Like this character has this virtue, and that's a good thing.
This character is the hero. This character is the
right, and we know that not because we were pre-told. Like you know, when you sat down and what's an example of a story you would hear as a child.
David and Goliath.
Sure, David and Goliath. We'll take a biblical story, but it doesn't always have to be a biblical story. We can acknowledge without being told as a kid that David is the good guy and Goliath is the bad guy. Or the first time you watch Mulan as a kid, you don't need to be told
that Mulan is
that the Hun are bad
and
that Mulan and the rest of the Chinese army are good.
Yeah.
Like you can intuit that because of their
characteristics.
Either their artistic renditions, their character traits, their behavior, and their value systems. Like you can intuit that as a kid.
Well, I mean, even in like Macbeth, for example, right? Like Macbeth is not the hero, and like you know that. Like he may be the main character, but he's not the hero of that story.
Right, and that's what the old role of the tragedy comes from. Is that here's this person with all this great value, and they fall. So that's why it was such a popular story trope. Same as the hero myth was the tragedy.
Yes.
But that's because we have the ability to discern these values out of the story, out of these works of literature. And it's not like, we polled 100 men to see if Mulan or Shen Yu was the good guy, and all of them said Mulan. Like, no. We knew that before, without asking anyone. We might have thought Shen Yu was cool. We might have thought the Hun looked kind of cool, but we knew that they weren't the good people.
Yeah.
And we knew that from 5 years old.
Right. Somehow it's easier to understand that as a kid.
There's not all this talk about, but what happens if the Hun society was being persecuted by the rest of the Chinese and all that?
Right, you can add complicating factors, but
at the end of the day, one's good, one's bad.
In
the story.
So that's more of the take that I have on Nietzsche's each person must establish their own will to live, because I think that we can see within art, literature, music, math, that there are these gradients of value.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, that you could hypothetically write a story with the perfect hero, and you could write a story with the absolute worst hero that no one would find inspiring whatsoever. Now, I think that that's what the Bible offers over here is the story of the
perfect selfless
pinnacle hero.
Yes.
The highest hero, the person that just from a literary aspect embodies the best qualities in every capacity and has no flaw. And that you should aspire to this. Like, even if you don't really read it as a religious text, like from a story, if you just read it as a story in and of itself, you would know that this is a good person and that you should aspire to be like this person. Exactly. And so then you would be like, well, how would I aspire to be this person? Then you take a look at the values and how, in this case of the Bible, how Jesus conducts his life, what his will to live is. Now, his will to live is to serve others.
Exactly.
And to serve God. So perhaps that's what you should start with. Perhaps that's what you should start with. If he's the highest, now, I don't think that there's a better story than the story of Christ as far as the embodiment of the hero.
I mean, even like
there's other really good ones.
Like within the story of Christ, like one of my favorites examples of like the virtues that Christ espouses is the agony in the garden, where he's praying there and literally has the desire to not go forth with what he knows he has to do, but is still willing.
Does it anyway.
Is still willing to do it anyway.
Right.
Like, I mean, and there's countless times, like throughout the Bible, where Christ has that, like, exemplifies the best traits. Like, that's just one example.
Right.
But you are completely right that throughout the entire story of, like, Christ's time on the earth, he's the pinnacle of what the hero should aspire to be.
Right, because you can take it out of little smaller stories, like The Lion King. That's why Disney movies used to be so popular, was because they got some of these things very correct. And so you could be like The Lion King. Oh, Simba's the good character. Why is Scar the bad character? Okay, well, I'll avoid the things that Scar does, like kill your brother. Like, that's the Cain and Abel story. I will emulate the things about Simba that are good, So his development into adulthood and his willingness to come back and fight for what is right.
Mm-hmm.
So then you take that, and then maybe you move on to the next story of Mulan, since we're already talking about Mulan, like fighting for what is right above what is culturally accepted.
Mm-hmm.
Fighting for the defense of her father's life, who she knew was going to die in battle because he was crippled and old. So, that's considered a good thing. Well, why? Maybe I should consider embodying this and cutting out this thing. Why are the Hun bad? Maybe I should avoid that. And so I think, personally, I think that the story of Christ is, like I said, the embodiment of all of those things. And so that he's the highest heroic model.
Yes.
And that this concept of establishing your own will to live and establishing your own set of values. Well, what is the best mode of doing that? What's going to make you the best person for your family and your friends? What's going to make you the most helpful person in your community, maybe even in society and in your country as a whole, is if you embody these things. And I think that we can establish that, and it brings it right back out of Nietzsche's dissolving of God into individual experience, into a universal person experience where it's, God is dead and therefore, and blah, blah, blah. Well, we need to avoid nihilism, so we need some values. Well, what values should we take? Well, we should take the values of the highest good. And if you conglomerate all of the best qualities of everything imaginable into one being, that is how you define God.
Yes.
That's Jesus Christ.
That's the pinnacle.
Yes.
And that's what you should aspire to.
For sure.
So I think it's an up and down, like a
up and down hill where society itself keeps going.
Almost a self-fulfilling argument.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, because he acknowledges that it's not good to therefore just fall completely off into nihilism.
Correct.
So in order to combat that, you have to have values. Well, which values? And that's how you get back into the question of rebuilding up.
Yes.
And that, that reminds me of I think a powerful line from Fulton Sheen. He mentions back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, all people want to do is tear down. Like, tear down the police, tear down the government, tear down the family, tear down the church. He's like, but you cannot build anything down. You can't. And if you only tear down, you will only end in ruin. You will only end at the lowest. And we acknowledge the lowest to be the worst scenario. Yeah. It's like, so the only thing you can do is build up. What can you do to build up from the devastation? What can you build to build up from the sorrow or the scourge of drugs, the scourge of alcohol? You build up. You don't destroy. And so, what do you build to?
Exactly.
You have to build to the highest good, which is God.
And Nietzsche,
at least in some capacity, it's God.
And Nietzsche would argue that the highest form of good, which I think we can all agree that he would be wrong in this case, is finding the will to carry on despite the burden of suffering. And the reason we would disagree with that,
I think he's right about it, but I think that there's a best way to do it.
It's because he's saying that God is not part of
we would disagree with that saying, but we would disagree with his overall sentiment that you have to find a way to get past the suffering. And
you must find your own will to live.
And the best will to live is through God.
Yes.
Or at the very least, the best will to live is the one that generates good for yourself and for others, perhaps for others at some cost to you, freely.
Yes.
Out of love rather than out of selfishness.
Yep.
And, if you, like we said, if we establish that into the highest, like the best across the board, the best in all traits, that is how you get to this level of God.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
So back to what you're saying with the building high and low. Right now in our society, where do you think we're at on that? Since it fluctuates between.
Yeah. I think we're very much in the tear down phase.
Okay.
I think everyone's and I think because we see it with Nietzsche, he says God is dead and we have killed him. And we acknowledged at first that he believed that to be progress.
Mm-hmm.
We're freeing science from theology. We're freeing government from theology. People are being ruled by the power of the governed, not by the divine authority.
Mm-hmm.
He believed that to be progress, and perhaps he has some right to believe that. But after a certain point of tearing that down, he acknowledged that, well, if you tear that down, then society falls apart and everyone falls into nihilism if you don't replace it. So, at first Nietzsche wants to tear what was previously established down.
Yep.
And then once he realized, okay, maybe there was some progress gained here, but we can't just continue to tear it down because there we end up in nihilism. And nihilism is not a good way to run a society.
Yep.
It devolves into chaos. Well, we need to build some values. We need to build a will to live, even if it's on the individual level. You build your own will to live, and so you start building.
Yep.
So I think right now we see with Nietzsche this little up and down. I'm sure in our own personal lives we can see plenty of up and down if we think about it long enough. And I think as a society, we've been going down since
70s, 80s.
Maybe earlier than that.
I think there's a slight up after World War II
there was
with Christian and family values.
And the spread of... Okay, yeah, we can maybe establish the start of coming down in the 60s.
So,
well, I'm going off your point, Brett. There was a survey that I came across where it was only 16% of Americans said that religion is the most important thing in their lives.
Yeah.
So I think, to your point, I think we are on that downward trope, and America has never been this pro-Christian country in an essence. I would definitely say that we were founded on Christian values, but there have been arguments.
It's certainly not been pro-Catholic.
No, throughout the entirety of America, where enshrined in our Constitution, God
we trust.
Yeah, God is enshrined in our Constitution. But then there's also these arguments for separation of church and state to prevent one religion from
ruling over.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think
But I don't think 16% is a good number by any means.
Well, being from Virginia, I have a few of the founding fathers that we learn in history class, perhaps a bit more than you non-Virginians. But, Thomas Jefferson was very clear when he established these things. He believed, he might not have been the prime example of a good Christian in America at the time. Perhaps he wasn't. But he said, if these values are founded in God, in Christian morality.
Yes.
And if citizens fail to believe in this God, the whole system will fall. And he knew that. Despite not being the most religious person, he at least knew that much.
Yeah.
That it was necessary, especially for the society that he had helped set up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think back to my question, I would argue that we are actually getting closer, starting back on the uphill.
Okay.
The reason for that is the article that originally got us interested in this topic was America's ups and downs with God, or
off and on relationship
with God. And in the article, it kind of pointed out throughout America's existence, it's gone up and down. And I've written these down. There's an example in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and there hasn't been one in the 20th or 21st century yet, 2000s. And it's okay, these are multi-decade awakenings almost. So the 1730s and 40s was the first great awakening in America, the colonies. And then 20s through 50s was the second. And then from the 20s to 70s, there's a Christian awakening or Christian revival throughout America. And that's where a lot of the family values were
That's
popular.
where the nuclear family became codified.
Exactly. But I think ever since the 70s, it's been, maybe even the 60s, it's been downhill from there. And we've gotten to this point where you said there's only 16% of Americans that have religion as their first priority in life.
Was it 16?
16.
Okay. I thought, for some reason I was thinking of 7, so at least it's 16.
16 is a lot more than 7. But
16 is still not.
I think
it's better than 7.
Exactly. But we can see there's like goals in trying to bring back people to the at least the Christian community, like the Eucharistic revival in the Catholic Church. That's trying to reinforce the values of Christianity and the importance of the Eucharist to everyone, especially young kids, or not young kids, but young adults. The importance of this, and I think like you can see the same in Protestant churches, like they're doing a lot of outreach to younger communities. And I think this outreach to younger communities right now is not apparent just because we aren't the base of the workforce at the point, but 10, 15 years down the line,
when they establish families
and they establish those values in their kids, you're going to see this 60% become gradually larger and even reach that 40-50% mark like it used to be. I think right now we're in the start of the 21st century revival of the Christian faith.
Yeah, I think really all you have to do is look back to church history and the Jewish tradition. Like if you go read through the Old Testament, like it's always, our lives are kind of bad. Oh, God has freed us from this thing. We are with God. We don't need God anymore.
Oh,
help, God, please help.
Our lives are bad.
It's
better again.
Thank goodness God is here to help us.
Exactly.
Oh, we don't need him anymore.
And I think we may still be declining a little bit, but I think if we haven't hit rock bottom yet, we're close to it, and it's only going to be uphill.
I hope so.
We can hope.
I hope so.
But I think it's going to start being uphill very soon, throughout America at least.
Well, at least that's what we're trying to accomplish, at least in small capacity with what we're doing here. One last thought that I kind of wanted to touch on, maybe before we wrap up, as I was writing my notes down before this so that I have all my thoughts kind of fresh. But I had this little thought while I was writing my notes. I just wanted to share it and see what y'all thought. So I was thinking that Adam and Eve's first temptation was this. After everything that they had, so they had been given all of creation, every need and want that they could possibly have is fulfilled. They have no needs. God has provided everything for them. They were tempted by the devil, by the serpent. But what were they tempted with? They were tempted that if they were to just disobey God, that the reason that God didn't want them to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was because God was actually afraid that because he knew that if they ate it, they'd become gods too, and they no longer needed him. And that was the temptation. Here, I'll just read it. But basically, that the temptation offered forth to them was that they could become like gods themselves. They would no longer need to be under God. Even though they already have the needs, they could be their own creators themselves. And the only thing that's keeping them from doing that is this thing that God said if they do it, they'll die. But, the serpent says he's lying about that. You won't die. God's lying. He's just afraid.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can find it real quick. I didn't really, like I said, it just kind of came rather quickly beforehand, so I didn't sit there and go flesh it out completely. Is there any initial thoughts while I find this?
I'm curious to see where you're going with it exactly.
Okay. Blah, blah, blah. Formed man, we're working on it. Not good for man to be alone. That's a good topic. I think we should talk about that eventually. Okay. He says, now this is the start of chapter 3. Now the serpent was more subtle than any of the beasts of the earth which the Lord God hath made. And he said to the woman, Why hath God commanded you that you should not eat the tree of paradise? And the woman answered him, saying, Of the fruit of the trees that are in paradise we do eat, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of paradise God hath commanded us that we should not eat, and that we should not touch it, lest perhaps we die. Which, first of all, they're tempted by saying, first, oh, he doesn't let you have anything? And like, no, he lets us have stuff, just not this one, or we'll die. It says, and the serpent said to the woman, No, you shall not die, for God doth know that in what day soever you shall eat thereof, your eyes shall be open, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And so the woman saw that the tree was good to eat and fair to the eyes and delightful to behold. She took thereof and did eat and gave to her husband. Mm-hmm. So the reason I bring this up is because of your note on Nietzsche saying we need to establish our own values and our own will to live. Mm-hmm. That's what, in a sense, the act of being God, establishing your own value and your own will to live. And I also think it ties well into this question: must we become gods simply to appear worthy of killing God? So that was just a connection I thought about before we established this. It was just kind of a last thought that I wanted to touch on. Do you want to develop the point anymore? Do you see anything, any connection, any spark that
must we become gods to justify our killing of God?
Yeah. That was his last question in the quote, and then also his result, his answer to how are we going to conduct a society that's not nihilistic, as you pointed out, was, well, people need to establish their own will to live.
And which, in a sense, become their own gods.
Yeah, which the fundamental purpose of God is the ultimate will to live, is in service to him. So Nietzsche is saying that, no, it's not that we are here to serve God, it is that we're here and we must create our own will to live. Mm-hmm. So that, in a way, is actually the exact temptation of the serpent.
Forbidden fruit. Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent relation to the Bible, and it shows that you have everything you need with God. You disobey him, you try killing him in a sense, and be your own God. Mm-hmm. You lose so much, and
you get cast out of paradise.
You get cast out of paradise, exactly.
And you're ashamed of yourself. You become naked, you become aware of your nakedness, and you're ashamed. Yeah. And you're no longer in paradise.
Exactly. I think that's exactly how it is in the world today, where if you're trying to be your own God and live for yourself and not for other people and for God, you're suddenly depressed all the time. It's hard to find a will to live sometimes. But if you do follow God...
And now you must labor 6 out of the 7 days of the week. Now you must work. That was one of their punishments, is now they have to work. Yeah. Before, and I think that's something that I've heard from people who serve as priests, religious, or non-religious, lay people fathers, mothers, but people who put their life in service to God and in charity and in love and not selfishness. They always, or even just people who do jobs for love of their craft, and do it for other people. They are self-fulfilled in that, so that their work does not become work. That love of motherhood and fatherhood is no longer, for some people, for these people who
don't have a God,
who cast it out, and it's all of a sudden being a parent is awful. You should never have kids. Mm-hmm. Whereas you get these parents who are very loving and very firm believers in this text, and they do not see it as work.
They see it as
a duty. It's a duty, but it's a blessing.
It's a blessing.
Children are a blessing to them.
Like my parents, 8 kids is a lot for them. It's a lot of, not work, because that's the point we're trying to go around.
But it is a lot of work fundamentally.
It's a lot of work fundamentally, but they enjoy every second of it.
They don't see it as work anymore.
They love seeing their kids succeed. They love putting their effort into the kids to let them enjoy life. And it's a blessing to them.
And they're willing to sacrifice the rest of their time to provide for 8 kids.
Exactly. And I think everyone who believes in God and has a family sees their family like that. Like, yes, they have to put a lot of time in. That's their duty. But they don't see it as work. They see it as a blessing of life.
Yeah. Ryan, do you have any final thoughts on that, maybe? Any enlightenment?
I kind of want to readdress your one question, that one question that Nietzsche proposes. And it kind of ties to a scene that's kind of stuck with me for a long time from the movie God's Not Dead.
Okay.
So the one son goes to his mother. His mother has dementia and is basically close to death, but she's this hardcore believer, has believed all her life, and tries to keep that straight and narrow path.
Yeah.
And he goes, "You prayed and believed your whole life, never did anything wrong, and here you are. You're the nicest person I know. I'm the meanest." And like he's commenting on her condition of like dementia, because like he's like, "Oh, she's not gonna remember this." Like he's like he doesn't care, and she responds, "Sometimes the devil allows people to live a life free of trouble because he doesn't want them turning to God. Their sin is like a jail cell, except it's all nice and comfy, and there doesn't seem to be any reason to leave. The door's wide open." And she like continues. She's like, and eventually one day the door will close.
Shuts.
Yeah, and that I think that just kind of ties into our whole conversation, because if we believe that, like as Nietzsche proposes, if you believe that you can kill God and you can replace him with this will to live despite the suffering, and then like things start to go your way right in life, then you're like, oh, like the curve, like you said, like we don't need God, like, and you could probably, as this example kind of points out, like, you could go your whole life free of trouble, like turning away from God, but eventually, as I think all three of us believe, the bill is going to come due. Like, like there is going to be a reckoning, and you are either going to be condemned or you're going to be saved for your conduct on earth. So that's just one of my like favorite movie scenes. I think it's very interesting, very telling, with just some of the ways that people view either the death of God or that God is still alive and present, and how they conduct themselves in their lives.
Yeah, that one story had me thinking of like 5 different Fulton Sheen quotes, monologues, homilies. That's a different topic we can get into later, perhaps.
Yeah,
but,
I think that's a great example to.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to wrap that up. So thank you for that, and thank you for listening. And hopefully you may have learned something from this. I know that I think I have.
I definitely took something from this conversation.
So
great conversation.
I think this might be our new best episode yet. So hopefully we can keep working up. Well, and thank you all, and have a blessed day.